Good morning and welcome to the OK Grognard Show. It is Monday, April 13th, 2020, 10:30 a.m. Central Time in beautiful Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Going to have a little campaign and world building discussion, and we're going to look at something written by Gary Gygax in 1975. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but first, let's have a quick look at a belated announcement. I was finally able to get a hold of the drawing winner for last week's set of dice. The dice chosen were the Emerald set, along with a 20-sided. And the winner was I double check that just to make sure I get the name right. The winner was Vulture Scorpion. That's Dennis. He tells me he's got a nephew who's just starting to game, and he'll be passing those along. He's going to hold off on getting those sent until after the work is done at the Riviera, so this dice can be taken down to the Gygax Memorial Stone and a picture taken, and so they can be blessed. So we will definitely do that. I should also say that I will remind people of the schedule. Today, of course, is cartography and or world building. Today's focus will be on world building. But don't forget, on Tuesday and Friday we do board games. Wednesday there'll be a campaign discussion. Thursday, over on Anchor, you'll find another portion of a public domain reading, Robert E. Howard's The Hour of the Dragon. That's currently being edited and will be up by Thursday. Saturday we'll do a review of another episode, probably of the D&D animated cartoon. I think we're up to episode 4 on that. And of course Sunday, the regular weekly winner prize announcement. But today, world building. And we're looking at this piece, which you can find on archives.org at this URL, which we will add into the show notes. This was the second part of a series. Sadly, the first part unavailable, but this seems to start it off fairly quickly. It foregoes, well, as it says, let us assume that you have shelled out the requisite number of dollars to purchase all the materials necessary for a D&D campaign, rules, dice, reams of various kinds of paper, pencils, and so forth. Several persons have expressed a desire to play the game, so all you really need now is the game. And it's true. You can have the rules for any edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and until the DM puts together a game, whether that's picking up materials that are already written or building something of their own, you really don't have a game. Artegel Justicar has joined us in the chat. I'll get you in on the drawing. Make sure that you're included for next week's drawing of a dice set. Let's see. Okay. Make sure you're in there now. There we go. Quick question for the chat. Have you seen this? What's up on the screen before? It's pretty interesting. Basically, it says once you've gotten all the physical manifestations of putting a game together, you'd still have to put together the setting. And as I say, whether that's purchasing a setting, adventure, or some parts thereof, or building your own, there's really no game yet. And the different levels of putting together a game are detailed here in 5 points. 1, the overall setting of the campaign. 2, the countryside of the immediate area. 3, the location of the dungeon where most adventures will take place. 4, the layout and composition of the nearest large town. And 5, eventually the entire world, and possibly other worlds, times, and dimensions, and so forth, to be structured, mapped, and added. Gary goes on to say this might seem to be too large a task, but it isn't really if you and your players are enjoying the game. And it is odds on you will. Furthermore, not all 5 things need to be done before play commences. In fact, most of the fine referees I know of, says Gary, work continually on their campaign, adding, changing, and expanding various parts continually. A thorough discussion of each of the 5 areas of the campaign play is necessary before considering how to go about involving players in the affair. He says, step 1 is something you have to do in your head. Now, fantasy, swords and sorcery games need not have any fixed basis for the assumptions made by its referee. My own doesn't, he says. Except those which embrace the whole of fantasy. This sort of campaign can mix any and all of various bases, which will be mentioned below, and then some. Regardless for what setting you opt, keep it secret from your players, or else they can study your sources and become immediately too knowledgeable, thus removing the charm of uncertainty. Settings based upon the limits, if one can speak of fantasy limits, can be very interesting in themselves, providing the scope of the setting will allow the players relative free rein in their imaginations. Typical settings are Teutonic Norse mythology, medieval European folklore, including King Arthur, Holger the Dane, and so on. The Hyborian Age, created by Robert E. Howard. Fritz Leiber's Newan, with Fafnir and the Grey Mouser. Indian mythology and lost continents such as Atlantis, or Mu. I'm not familiar with that. Regardless of the setting, you can have it all taking place on an alternative Earth or parallel world. In this way, minor variations can easily be explained, justified. When the setting is decided upon, some good books dealing with it should always be kept handy. The time has come to begin working on the campaign. We'll get to section 2 in just a second. Article Justicar says in the chat, I was telling a new DM similar advice last week, suggesting that she focus first on an initial adventure and then detailing more later once she gets some momentum. Yeah, it's very true. It's good to start off. In fact, the original 3 little booklets suggest creating a dungeon in a small civilized area, a village, a town, whatever, nearby where people can provision and use as a jumping off point for their forays into whatever dungeon or underworld you create nearby. So some of this advice in this article is very similar to that, in that it suggests having a dungeon where the adventures take place in a nearby large town. That I thoroughly agree with. It's the way I started back in '74 when we started playing. Several of us created our own little dungeons and towns nearby the dungeon, and people would just roll up character after character, and they had till they got some that actually survived adventures and could start leveling up with those characters. They would go through a lot of them. Of course, in early editions, you would hire a lot of individual henchmen and hirelings, people that could share in the adventure. People that could be there to share the risks, and of course the rewards, but also act in some ways as shields against the dangers that you would encounter. If you've got half a dozen hirelings along with one PC, then the creatures that are taking swings at you and doing damage are spreading that out, and hopefully more of you survive that way. Gary goes on in this article to say, Step 2 requires sitting down with a large piece of hex-ruled paper and drawing a large-scale map. A map with a scale of 1 hex equals 1 mile, or 2 kilometers for those who enjoy European measures, I suppose, is what he's saying. Although he says, I often use rods, chains, furlongs, and leagues too. Will allow you to use your imagination to devise some interesting terrain and places, and it will be about right for player operations such as exploring, camping, adventuring, and eventually building their strongholds. Even such small things as a witch's hut and side entrances to the dungeon can be shown on the map. Central features of the map must be the major town and dungeon entrance. Article Justicar also says, as an aside, just read 3 Hearts and 3 Lions with Sir Holger. Yes, Appendix N, which was a appendix in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, is available on the Internet Archive. Definitely people who haven't heard of it should look that up and check out some of the sources, some of the fantasy and sword and sorcery and pulp sources that inspired Gary and other early gamers in their creation of their own worlds. There's a lot of great reading to be had there, and 3 Hearts and 3 Lions is just one of many fun reads. I enjoyed it myself. Well, that may seem like a random side note, it's definitely germane, because we don't create in a vacuum. We need inspiration for our creations. Everything comes from something. So without that fodder for your muses, you wouldn't have a whole lot going on in your world that had a very strong basis, touchstones, if you will, for your players to pick up on and to enjoy and make things, I don't want to say real, but more realistic. The countryside of the immediate area can be pretty vague, really. Just a simple map with some trees and hills and The location of the town relative to the dungeon and the distances thereof do make it a lot easier for players through their characters to interact with the setting, get a feel for where they are and some sense of distances and time, because they feed one another. Gary goes on in step 3 to say, step 3 involves the decision aspect already mentioned and the actual work of sitting down and drawing dungeon levels. This is very difficult and time consuming. Each level should have a central theme and some distinguishing feature. For example, a level with large open areas swarming with goblins, one where the basic pattern of corridors seem to repeat endlessly, one inhabited by nothing but fire-dwelling or fire-using monsters, etc. As each level is finished, the various means of getting to lower levels must be keyed and noted on the appropriate lower levels, so that if a room sinks 4 levels, it will then be necessary to immediately show it on 4 sheets of graph paper, numbered so as to indicate successively lower levels. A careful plan of what monsters and treasures can be found where on each level is also most necessary, and it can take as long to prepare as the level itself, for you may wish to include something unusual, a treasure, monster, and or trick or trap not shown in D&D on each level. Gary does wax a bit on his own setting. He says, before the rules for D&D were published, Old Greyhawk Castle was 13 levels deep. The first level was a simple maze of rooms and corridors, for none of the participants had ever played such a game before. The second level had 2 unusual items, a Nixie pool and a fountain of snakes. The third featured a torture chamber and many small cells and prison rooms. The fourth was a level of crypts and undead. The fifth was centered around a strange font of black fire and gargoyles. The sixth was a repeating maze with dozens of wild hogs, 3 dice, in inconvenient spots, naturally backed up by appropriate numbers of werebores. The seventh was centered around a circular labyrinth and a street of masses of ogres. The 8th through 10th level were caves and caverns featuring trolls, giant insects, and a transporter nexus with an evil wizard with a number of tough associates guarding it. The 11th level was the home of the most powerful wizard in the castle. He had Balrogs as servants. The remainder of the level was populated by Martian white apes, except the subpatches system underneath the corridors, which was full of poisonous critters with no treasure. Level 12 was filled with dragons. The bottom level, number 13, contained an inescapable slide which took players clear through to China, quote unquote, from whence they had to return via outdoor adventure. It was quite possible to journey downward to the bottom level of an insidious series of slanting passages which began on the 2nd level, but the likelihood of following such a route unknowingly didn't become too great till the 7th or 8th level. Of the dozen or so who played on a fairly regular basis, 4 made the lowest level and took the trip. Talks about Rob, now a co-referee in the campaign, went alone. And 3 of his friends managed to trace part of his route and blunder along the rest so that they followed him quickly to the land of China. Side levels included a barracks with orcs, hobgoblins, and gnolls continually warring with each other, a museum, a huge arena, an underground lake, a giant's home, and a garden of fungi. This is a fascinating look at him describing the many levels of Greyhawk Castle in a very brief article for a fanzine in the early days of Dungeons and Dragons. It's quite humorous to see that detailed in such a way. Article Justicar says, the idea of dungeon level themes is really germane to me right now. I'm reworking the Tower of Xenopus sample dungeon from Holmes and working on additional levels below the starting one. First level by Holmes is really a kind of faction contest. Thaumaturgus versus Goblin versus Pirates. Next level down, trying to think of a theme that's related to why Xenopus died mysteriously in green flame. Haunted level as an entry point to an ancient civilization? Yeah, that is neat. You know, there's the idea possibly that someone achieving lichdom and failing at it might die that way. And that might play into your haunted level as there's a sort of an undead tie-in that way. So I don't know, something to consider. Gary continues with his article saying, Step 4, which as we know is the layout and composition of the nearest large town, should be handled concurrently with designing the first 3 or 4 dungeon levels. Here your players will find lodgings, buy equipment, hire mercenaries, seek magical and clerical aid, drink, gamble, and wench, quote unquote. The town would do well to resemble some of those in Howard's Conan series or Liver's City of Lankbar. Strange towers, a thieves' quarter, temples of horrible deities, and add greater flavor to play. The Thieves' Guild, a society of evil clerics, a brotherhood of lawful men, and so on, bring a bit more interest also. If a few warring nobles from the surrounding territory also send large parties of men into the place occasionally, some interesting brawls can occur. Honest and dishonest merchants should be indicated. Taverns, which drug patrons, should likewise be indicated, and so on. In any event, be sure and leave room for additional things in expansion. And that's very important to note. The idea that, article Justicar, you like the failed lich attempt idea, huh? You know, something about you putting it in that way with the green flame just brought that to mind. I don't know why. So, once again, it's one of those situations where nobody creates in a vacuum, right? You say something, I say something that plays off of it, and then maybe you build on it and take it a little further down the field. I'm glad you like it. I hope it pans out even more for you. And to that point, in the event, leave room for additional things in expansion. Yeah, you know, it's always good to have less detailed areas on the map that allow you room to expand and fit in new ideas you come up with. If you detail absolutely everything before anybody plays in it, then maybe there's no room left for new ideas you come up with that you feel might be fun ones for your players to jump into. Maybe they say something that that causes an idea to spring to mind that you can then run with if there's room to put it in. But if you've boxed yourself into a corner where you've detailed everything so far that there's just no room to add anything new, then you're kind of stuck. So always leave yourself open to new influences, new ideas, and leave room in your setting everywhere for some things to be developed. I can't help but mention at this point that every now and then you read a review of a old school product that comes out nowadays, and the review discusses how they were disappointed that this wasn't fleshed out or that wasn't fleshed out for them. And it's my understanding, and I think most people would agree with this, that do old school gaming, that you always leave that room in there. And if there's a product that comes out that doesn't have room for a DM to flesh things out in some ways for themselves, then it's really not adhering to those kind of old school ideas of keeping things open and creating a setting that can grow and expand even as the players interact with it. Step 5. And remember, Step 5 was eventually the entire world, times, dimensions, so forth. 5 is, as noted, something you won't immediately have to worry about, but it is a good idea to have a general plan in mind immediately. The general geography of the world, quote-unquote, should be sketched out, and if you plan to make it possible to visit other worlds, times, or places, the general outline of all such areas should also be sketched out. For example, you might wish to have the moon an inhabitable and inhabited place, which can be traveled to by means of a flying carpet. A description of this lunar world should be located somewhere as well as a means of getting there. But only after you have something solid in the way of maps and the like. Having accomplished those parts of the 5 steps which are immediately necessary, probably taking a week or so, you are ready to begin play. Let us further assume that there are 4 prospects. These players should begin together and, for a time at least, operate as a team if possible. Each in turn rolls 3 dice to record the various scores for the makeup of the character they are to play, and how large an initial bankroll the character begins with. This accomplished, players decide what class of character they wish to play, the type, human, elf, etc., and the alignment of the character. The latter can be secretly told the referee, with an announced alignment being false. At this stage, each player locates his base in some inn or the like, and then they can set forth to explore the town and purchase their adventuring equipment. Those that are careful and or lucky might also be able to hire a few men-at-arms to accompany them. The latter is particularly true if players pool their funds. In a short time, the first dungeon expedition can be made, but that is the subject of part 3 of this series, and so we'll return to it again later. So we won't go into the rest of this when it talks about character type, and you can read that on your own, but it's interesting enough to see how he helps a burgeoning DM kick off a campaign by suggesting these very things. Well, we're about at the half-hour mark. Article Justicar, thank you very much for joining us in the chat and making some very interesting comments. And I appreciate it very much. I will thank you. If you want to stick around in the chat, feel free. I'm just going to stop the stream now to close off the show. It's enough for me to say. Thank you very much. Anybody who's listening to this later, I appreciate it. This is the OK Grognard Show, an episode on world building on Monday, April 13th, and we'll catch you again soon.